All right, good friends, welcome back. Tom Kiley, INN World Report Radio. Now, it's been a couple of months since we've had Webster Tarpley on the show. Dr. Tarpley is on the line now, and let's get right to it. Webster, welcome back to INN.
Thank you, Tom. How are you doing?
Well, very well, thank you. And partially because I've just been following this amazing history you've been digging up for us about the Russian Tsar Alexander coming to the aid of the United States. Why don't we get right to it? Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about that?
Well, this was a program that was broadcast on C-SPAN 3, C-SPAN, American History, Television, Civil War, TV, I guess it is. And it was on twice on Saturday and once on Sunday, but you can always see it. You go to the C-SPAN video archive and just type in Tarpley and take the one from 2013. I think I have three up there, one from 2006, one from 2012, and then one from now. So take the one from now. It's called Russia's Participation in the American Civil War. And it's a funny story. I've been aware of this for quite a while, that the only military aid coming to Lincoln and the Union during the entire Civil War was the considerable military aid represented by the Russian high seas battle fleets, right? The Russian Navy. The majority of the Russian Navy was sent to New York City and San Francisco in September, October of 1863 and stayed in the United States all during the winter of 1863-64. So on the one side, it's New York City, September 24th, 1863, in the summer after Gettysburg, after Vicksburg, after these awful draft riots, after the Battle of Chickamauga, which was a Union defeat. There's a tremendous morale boost coming in the form of the 6 or 7 ships of the Russian Baltic Atlantic fleet showing up there in New York Harbor. And then on October 12th, the Russian Pacific Fleet from Vladivostok showing up in San Francisco. And what these fleets essentially represented was a commitment by the Russian Empire that if the British and the French carried out their threat to intervene in the Civil War on the side of the slaveholding Confederacy, to be sure, that the British and the French would find themselves not just at war with the United States, but they'd also be at war with Russia. Of course, that is not pleasant because of these huge land armies and the immense spaces and tremendous resources of the Russian Empire. So what it meant was that the chance that the British and the French, the British under Lord Palmerston and Lord John Russell and Henry Gladstone, and the French under Napoleon III, Napoleon le Petit, their chance to intervene essentially went out the window. They could no longer dare to attack Lincoln and the Union, because then they would be really crushed in a nutcracker between the U.S. and Russia. So they were wise to cease and desist, and there never was this much touted intervention. And what it goes back to is that there were at least 2, maybe 3, but certainly 2 important moments when the British and the French were fixing to attack. And the Tsar of Russia, Alexander II, stopped them both times. One of them is when Lee was invading Maryland for the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, and then, of course, in the Gettysburg invasion of July 1863. And this is really the main event of the Civil War in foreign policy terms and in world strategic terms, because it's decisive, right? It's huge. It's as important as any battle, and maybe more important than any single battle, because it accomplished the idea that there would not be a foreign invasion, a foreign contribution. And for the Confederacy, that's decisive, because there's almost no scenario for Confederate victory, for Confederate secession, right, separation, that does not involve the British and the French coming in to save the Confederates from the superior resources of the Union. And that's really the ball game right there. Important guy in this is Cassius Marcellus Clay of Kentucky, Lincoln's ambassador to Russia. And one of the things I came across is, you think of the Thanksgiving proclamation, right? The first Thanksgiving, the first official federal holiday of Thanksgiving, I guess you'd say, is proclaimed by Lincoln around October 2nd, 1863. That's the first Thanksgiving proclamation. And then you wonder, what is he giving thanks for, right? Gettysburg and Vicksburg, of course, worth giving thanks for, but that's already in the first week of July. We're talking 90 days later, practically 3 months later, and I think you'd have to conclude that what he's giving thanks for is not the draft riots of July and not the defeat at Chickamauga, which was horrendous in September, but what he's really giving thanks for is the fact that the Russian fleets mean that the British and the French will not be able to carry out this long-threatened attack. And if you actually read the text of the Thanksgiving Proclamation, written apparently by Seward, Secretary of State, you'll see that it one of the clauses is sort of, we've been in this civil war. This looks like an engraved invitation to hostile foreign powers to come in against us, but so far we have not had to experience that, so we're going to give thanks, among other things, for that. And that really points you right directly to these Russian fleets. This whole thing has been suppressed. I went to Gettysburg this summer for the 150th anniversary, and there was about a week of lectures in a tent by the new visitor center there in Gettysburg, which everybody ought to go see. But I asked one of the most prestigious professors in the Civil War field, right? Some guy who is on C-SPAN all the time, really. And I said, were you aware that the Russian fleet in San Francisco was actually prepared to defend San Francisco against Confederate raiders like the Alabama, the Shenandoah, the Nashville, the Sumter? If they had shown up and started attacking San Francisco, well, they would have had to deal with this 5 or 6 ship Russian Pacific fleet, which would have been enough to take care of the Confederate raider, and that this was widely known at the time. Right, the Russian admiral was viewed as a kind of savior in the Northern California, right around the Golden Gate. So it's a very big thing, and this professor said, frankly, he didn't know that. Right, that fact in all of his vast erudition, he didn't know that. So what you're dealing with is a kind of an ideological block, right? That during the Cold War in particular, of course, it was very embarrassing that during the Civil War, the main foreign enemies were the British and the French, and the main friend was Russia. And this, of course, is the reverse of the alliance pattern of the Cold War.
Well, speaking of knowledge and why we don't know about it, in your writings, I see apparently Tsar Alexander was asked by the Europeans if he wanted to join in. Should they come and pick over the carcass? Why don't we talk about that when we get back?
Sure.
Friends, Webster Tarpley on the line. Just a fascinating history he's unearthed for us. One of the great reasons why we like to have him on the show. We'll be right back with him right after this. All right, good friends. Welcome back. We're talking history with a great historian, in my opinion, for many reasons, not the least of which he always makes it fascinating. Webster Tarpley on the line with us. We're talking about some lost history, as Robert Parry would call it, that we just are not allowed to know about for some reason. In this case, the Russian Empire coming to the aid of the United States several times throughout our history, but in this particular instance, not during World War II, but during the American Civil War. Webster, why is it first of all, the Russian Tsar knew what he was doing, because didn't the Europeans come to him and say, "Hey, you want a piece of this action? We're thinking about hitting the United States while it's down."
Yes, the first request came from Britain and France to Russia in September 1862, and as we found out, was not widely known at the time. The basic idea was known that Russia had said no, and that was known, that Russia had rebuffed this thing, but what was not known was how emphatic the rebuff actually was, and for that we had to wait until 40, 50 years after the Civil War, and a guy called Wharton Barker published a little memoir of the event, right? He basically had Alexander II towards the end of his reign, right before he was killed by British-controlled anarchists. Alexander II had told this guy Wharton Barker what had gone on, which of course was not public at the time. Right, there was no free press in Russia, and the British and the French sure weren't going to talk about it. So the idea was that the British and the French forwarded a request saying, Russia, please join us. We're going to attack the U.S. We're going to attack Lincoln and the Union. And the answer of Alexander II was, listen, I will not join this. I will reject it. And let me make it clear, boys, if you recognize the Confederacy and try to do anything about it, I will treat that as grounds for war. I will treat that as casus belli for Russia, and I will attack you. So you attack the Union, fine, I'll attack you. And at that point, the enthusiasm in London and Paris for all this cooled. You have to remember that the Russian land army had reached Paris in 1814, 1815. Right? That was the Russian occupation of Paris at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So there was a real military capability there, which they had all learned to respect very much, and they didn't want to tangle with Russia again. So that is it's a remarkable statement, and then that is the most emphatic form. But then it was repeated by the Russians, at various other times. And he actually, when Alexander II said, "Not only will I not join you, I will declare war on you," he also said, and I'm going to essentially make clear that this is not some kind of idle bluff. I'm going to send my fleet to New York and another fleet to San Francisco just to make sure you understand that I'm serious about this, right? I'm committed to the U.S. There are all kinds of statements where the Tsar says, we have to keep the Union intact. We got to maintain the blockade of the southern states. Russia might even help to blockade the southern states because the great fear of Alexander II was that he would be left all alone in the world facing Britain and France, right? Which is what had happened in the Crimean War, right? In the 1850s, Britain, France, and indeed Turkey, Ottoman Empire, had organized, they ganged up on Russia. That's the Crimean War. And that didn't get too far, but that was already, bad for Russia. But he was willing to risk another war so that he wouldn't be left alone on the planet just with these, this imperialist combo of the British and the French. And
so it wasn't for entirely altruistic reasons. He had a geopolitical reason.
No, but what do you expect? I mean, the best alliances are the ones that are deeply, solidly rooted in mutual interest. That's what they have to be based on.
Hey, I understand. I'm just trying to, figure. I figured as much, but I'm gratified to hear you to spell it out like that.
And you got to remember though, Alexander II is a great humanitarian. This is the guy who freed the serfs in 1860, 1861. There were 27 million serfs. Now, a serf is not a slave. You're not owned, but you're tied to the land and you owe service, right? And it's very bad, and it's about as bad as slavery. And he had been responsible for freeing these serfs, and not everything went well with that, but still, that was a tremendous step forward historically to get rid of serfdom in the largest country that still practiced it. Now, in terms of why, right? Why don't people know this? Why is this so suppressed, right? Why is it such a surprise? Most people would say, "Oh my God, I never heard of it," right? They never told me. There are several layers, right? One is the British after about 1870. They gave up on trying to destroy the U.S. They couldn't split the U.S. They originally thought they could split the U.S. into the Northeast, the South, the North Central or Midwest, and then some other parts, right? So maybe something going back to Mexico, who knows? But they gave up on that, and they said, well, we got to bore from within. So they started playing the race card, and the race card meant the Anglo-Saxon master race, right? Let's celebrate the fact that we're all Anglo-Saxons, right? We're all part of this mythical, racial construct, and that was powerful. That was one of their stocks in trade. This was very potent for somebody like Theodore Roosevelt, who was very insecure and loved the idea that he shared something with the King of England. There's also the Kennan family, right? George Kennan, the guy who contributed a lot to starting the Cold War. Kennan was a stooge of Harriman in the 1940s. He wrote the so-called Long Telegram saying that Stalin is going to be your enemy and you better get ready because he's really bad. This was then published in Foreign Affairs as Mr. X. So that's George E. Kennan. His relative, his ancestor, I guess we can say, is another George Kennan, same name, who was a human rights agitator of the 1880s and 1890s. And he went to Russia and he said, oh my God, there are concentration camps in Siberia and political prisoners are being sent to Siberia. And of course, this is not good, but you have to sort of relativize this, right? That's bad, but compared to what? How about the British? When India rebelled in the 1850s, 1857, the so-called Great Mutiny or Sepoy Rebellion, it's sometimes called. This was a rebellion all over India to kick out the British East India Company and their awful, oppressive, exploitative rule. They had people like John Stuart Mill working for them. The British put that down. How many did they kill? They might have killed 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 Indians killed in the process. So when the British come forward and say, oh, we're such humanitarians and we're so concerned about the human toll of the American Civil War, maybe we should just intervene, invade and attack and put an end to the killing. Well, again, you can't take them seriously as humanitarians, but Kennan ignored all of that, right? He ignored the crimes of the British and the French and just focused on the fact that there was Siberia with political prisoners. So he did a lot of poisonous propaganda around this. Another big turning point is 1905, when you have Theodore Roosevelt, right? One of the most mentally impaired of all presidents, right? Somebody who had mental age of about 5 or 6 years. Theodore Roosevelt decided that he was going to imitate King Edward VII of England in his foreign policy. And at this point, we had the Russo-Japanese War, right? Russia against Japan. And normally, the whole pattern of U.S. history up to then was the U.S. was always friendly to Russia. It goes back to Benjamin Franklin. It goes back to pre-revolutionary times, to Catherine the Great, to the War of 1812. The Civil
but he
War,
didn't like the Russians, Roosevelt, did he?
Theodore hated them. Because that was the British line. But the irony is, if you hate the Russians, it means you've got to support the Japanese, and that is what he did. The so-called mediation of the Russo-Japanese War by Theodore Roosevelt was the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which was a great victory for Japan and a big defeat for Russia. Theodore Roosevelt had to hurry to conclude that treaty because the Japanese empire was about to collapse financially. The Russians could have gone on, but the Japanese were much more fragile. So he had to run that whole thing in order to hide the weakness of the Japanese and deliver as much as he could. And the cherry trees that we have here in Washington, right, the famous cherry trees are the thank you from the Japanese for that piece of treachery by Theodore Roosevelt, which was a terrible, terrible mistake.
And then he encouraged them onto empire, spawning World War II. Oh, hold on, Webster. We'll be right back with Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley just after this. All right, good friends. Welcome back. Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley in the house. It's been too long. Usually we like to have Webster on the show once a month or so, but we've both been busy. However, before he continues, it's a great lecture he gave at the National Press Club down in Washington. It was caught on C-SPAN. Go to his website, tarpley.net. You can find it there, or go to C-SPAN 3 and query Tarpley, and pull up a chair. Webster, it's always fascinating. I find stuff that you did on YouTube from 20 years ago, and I'm learning about the Romans and everything. It's really interesting. Mm-hmm. But why don't you continue here? Let's finish up here with the, So
again, the first question was, why is this knowledge forgotten, suppressed, scorned? Right? Why doesn't some of the main professors in the field, they don't even know that the Russian admiral was prepared to defend San Francisco against the Confederates? I mean, it's really amazing. So we have the Kennan family, where Russophobia is the family business. And then we have Theodore Roosevelt in 1905. He says, "Down with the Russians and long live the Japanese in the Far East." This was the British policy was to essentially drive the Russians out of the Far East and back into Europe so that they could collide with Germany, which is then what happened. And that means that then the entire liberal Republican universe of academics and the Anglo-Saxon race patriots and all the rest of this stuff, all of those people then essentially become anti-Russian following King Edward VII and our wonderful Theodore Roosevelt. And then, of course, it becomes the Cold War. And all I could say about this is that I quoted in this the talk I gave Walter Lippmann, right? We were at the National Press Club, right? Walter Lippmann had been a real fixture of those halls there of the National Press Club here in Washington. And Lippmann, it's interesting, Lippmann wrote in a letter to a friend. He never published it in his column. When Roosevelt had died, there was a breathtaking anti-Russian turn, which was accomplished by this despicable little Harry S. Truman, Ku Klux Klan member from Missouri, ignoramus, puppet. He was run by Harriman and Atchison in foreign policy and by Clark Clifford in domestic policy. And he was so benighted that he often didn't know that he was being run, and other times he did. But Harriman came back. The last thing that Roosevelt had done on this earth was to get into a fight with Harriman, because Harriman said, "Let's pick a fight with Stalin about this, that, and the other thing." And Roosevelt said, "No, we will not. These are minor irritants, and I do not intend to let them become any bigger than they are." So Harriman had a hopeless task in starting the Cold War until Roosevelt was dead. Then he flew back to Washington and began to pour poison into the ears of this little Ku Klux Klan character, Harry S. Truman. And Lippmann observed all this, and he said, look, the main problem here is that the big strategic conflict in the world is between the Russians and the British Empire. And the United States could easily become the arbiter, right, the balancer of that, right, controlling, keeping that on an even keel and, above the fray. He said, instead of this, with Atchison, with Harriman and Truman, we the United States have taken the role of the main anti-Soviet force, right? And the British have been, laughing at this, but we shouldn't do that. We should essentially realize that U.S. national interest dictates a very close cooperation with the Soviet Union. That had been Roosevelt's policy. What Roosevelt thought would happen in the world of the 40s and 50s was it would be run by a United States-Russia condominium. Those two powers would essentially be the arbiters of the world. The British Empire would be there formally as part of the Big Three, but in reality they were so weak by comparison to the other two that they would, dwindle away. And one of the things that would be going on would be the destruction of colonialism, right? The end of colonialism. But instead, we didn't have that. And as soon as you decide to make common cause with the British against the Soviets, then you're stuck in the colonial mode, and that leads you pretty much directly into Vietnam, right? And all the horrible suffering. So what Lippmann was writing in 1945 was the Cold War is not necessary. It's essentially a creation of people like Harriman, right? And remember, Harriman had become practically a part of the Churchill family, right, by becoming the boyfriend of the former wife of Winston Churchill's alcoholic son, Randolph Churchill. A little bit complicated, but Harriman was a total Anglophile, and he was able to push this over on little Harry. So if you look at these ways, right, the Kennan, the Theodore Roosevelt, the Bull Moose, liberal Republican, Wall Street, and then the Cold War, you can see how this important, knowledge of the Russian fleet and and really the Russian alliance was what it came down to. All of that has sort of been driven out of the picture. But I hope now with this little lecture of mine that it'll have a fighting chance of coming back, because there's this mass of really interesting detail.
Really interesting. And I want to ask you a little bit about the Russian Revolution. But before I do, I noticed in the audience was Haynes Johnson, a guy who I've seen many times on Washington Week in Review. He seemed to be interested. I think I saw him sleeping a little bit one time.
Are you sure?
I think Haynes Johnson was sitting there. Yes.
I thought I would recognize Haynes Johnson. I'm not sure. I'll go
sure
back
looked like him. I mean, Anyways,
I'll go back and check.
I was wondering if. Well, look, why don't we, on this point now, there's a lot of really shrewd people listening in the audience, and a lot of us figure that the Russian Revolution itself was aided and abetted by the City of London. Certainly the Germans helped out, with spiriting Lenin back in, on the secret train and everything. How much of that is true? How much of that was to exact the bring down of the House of Romanov and, cause chaos there and, weaken Russia and so forth?
Again, you have to remember that for the 19th century, right, from about the time of the Congress of Vienna and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, so from about 1815 all the way to the so-called Anglo-Russian Entente of 1907, the main hostility in the world is the Russian Empire against the British Empire. That's the main line of conflict. And that is then supplemented by the other line of conflict, which is the United States against the British Empire. So the convergence is clear. The U.S. and Russia get along, first of all, because they share this anti-British hostility. Then, however, there's positive content, and that is the development economics. In other words, protectionism, dirigism, mercantilism, right? The American system of political economy. Alexander Hamilton, Henry Carey, Friedrich List. The Russians had their version of that, right? Essentially, there's a group of Russian modernizers that emerges around Stroganov, right? And this is quite possibly the inventor of beef stroganoff, or the guy after whom beef stroganoff is named. But he's a top noble prince or grand duke or so forth. So there's a group of about half a dozen of these reformers, and they emerge in the 1840s, and they say, all right, what do we do to make Russia stronger? And three things: free the serfs, go to free labor. Secondly, industrialize the country, build factories, build railroads. This implies you got to have a protective tariff to do that. You can't do it. Nobody can do it. Not Germany, not the U.S., not Italy, not Russia, unless you have a protective tariff. And then the third one is cooperate with the United States. Right? So free the serfs, industrialize the country, and cooperate with the U.S. against the British. And that's an effective program. Right? That's what was being pushed in Russia. The British respond by sponsoring, Bakunin, anarchists, terrorists, the Narodnaya Volya, the people who then assassinate Alexander II. Right? You think of it. The guy freed 27 million serfs, but the people's will, the Narodnaya Volya, they decide he's got to be assassinated. So Lincoln assassinated with help from the British, and Alexander II assassinated with help from the British. But what it also means is that the British then build up their networks. The British networks in Russia are, of course, a product of this long hostility, 100 years of conflict, and that is what King Edward VII pulls out in 1905, right? When Russia is at war with Japan, and Russia loses some key battles, right? They lose the naval battle of Tsushima and the land battle of Mukden. Then King Edward VII says, networks, go to town. And he's helped by the fact is that King Edward VII is the guy who has these bankers. He's got the Rothschilds. He's got Sir Thomas Lipton. He's got bankers who are Jewish and had been excluded from the British court, but they're allowed into the court as long as they provide services for King Edward VII. And they then mobilize their networks reaching into Poland, which most of Poland was part of Russia, although not all of it, but significant part. So those are sprung loose in 1905 to get the 1905 revolution. In 1917, it's that they take advantage of the fact to destroy Russia. They don't imagine they're going to have a stable Bolshevik government. They think they're just going to have chaos and the partition and dismemberment of the country.
Well, you know what? Can you come back on election night a week from tonight, because it's been so long and we're just getting warmed up?
If we come to the end of the program, let me remind people, you gotta check out Randy Credico for mayor of New York. Randy Credico running on the Tax Wall Street Party ticket, right? And this is a 0.5% tax on all Wall Street turnover, would at least double the income of the city of New York and finance not just preschool or pre-K, but a whole array of vital reforms. You can look at it at credico2013.org. And
okay.